What if the biggest thing holding XRP back right now isn't the market, but timing? Because behind the scenes, decisions are being delayed, conversations are happening quietly, and the outcome could reshape everything people think they know about this asset. This video is for educational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. Always do your own research before making any investment decisions. For a while now, the conversation around XRP hasn't been about what it can do, but why nothing seems to be moving. Announcements come and go, expectations build, and then nothing. That pattern has led a lot of people to assume the delays are just part of a slow regulatory process. But some analysts see it differently. They suggest the slowdown may be tied to competing interests behind the scenes, particularly from parts of the traditional financial system that benefit from how things currently work. Banks, for example, rely heavily on customer deposits. Those deposits aren't just sitting idle. They're used to generate returns through lending and other financial activities. If new blockchain-based financial tools begin offering alternative ways to hold and move value, especially with competitive yields, it could gradually shift how that system operates. That doesn't mean change happens overnight, but it does explain why new frameworks and regulations tend to face resistance before they're accepted. And if that's true, then what looks like a delay on the surface might actually be a negotiation happening underneath. But this isn't just about banks or regulation. Step back for a moment. Most people assume the global financial system is already optimized, fast, efficient, and modern. But a large portion of international money movement still relies on infrastructure like SWIFT, a system built decades ago. It works, but not perfectly. Transactions can take days. Multiple intermediaries are often involved, and costs can stack up quickly, especially across borders. Now compare that to what newer blockchain-based systems are trying to do. Companies like Ripple are building networks designed to settle transactions in seconds, with fewer intermediaries and more transparency. That doesn't mean the current system disappears overnight, but it does introduce an alternative, one that operates differently from the traditional model. And this is where XRP becomes part of a much bigger conversation, not as a competitor to every digital asset, but as a potential piece of infrastructure in how value moves globally. And once you start looking at it that way, the conversation shifts completely. Because now, it's not just about whether XRP gains attention. It's about what happens if systems like this begin to scale. Now here's where things stop being theoretical and start becoming measurable. Every year, hundreds of billions of dollars are sent across borders, especially through remittances. According to global estimates, the average fee on those transfers can sit around 5% to 7%. That's not a small number. It means billions are lost annually just to move money from one place to another. And for many people, those costs aren't optional. They're part of everyday life. This is exactly the inefficiency that blockchain-based systems are trying to address. Some analysts suggest that networks built for speed and direct settlement could reduce both time and cost significantly. And if that happens, even partially, it starts to reshape how value flows globally. Now take that idea one step further. Beyond remittances, there's a much larger layer: institutional settlement. Trillions of dollars move between banks, corporations, and governments every year. If even a small portion of that volume begins shifting toward faster settlement solutions, the demand for liquidity in those systems could increase. And that's where assets like XRP are often discussed, not as speculation, but as part of a potential liquidity mechanism. But here's the catch. None of this scales the way people expect without one key piece in place: regulatory clarity. And that's exactly where the story takes a turn. Publicly, the message around crypto has started to shift. Leaders who once avoided the topic are now speaking about it more openly, often framing it as an area the U.S. can't afford to fall behind in. Donald Trump, for example, has made statements suggesting that digital assets are becoming part of the broader financial conversation, and that leadership in this space matters. But beyond public comments, there have also been reports of private discussions involving policymakers, industry leaders, and financial stakeholders. Details from these meetings aren't fully confirmed. However, multiple sources suggest the focus has been on one thing: how to create a regulatory framework that allows innovation without destabilizing existing systems. That balance isn't easy. On one side, there's pressure to move quickly and stay competitive globally. On the other, there's caution from institutions that want to avoid disruption to current financial structures. And that tension is exactly why progress can feel slow from the outside. But recently, something has started to shift. The tone is changing, and so is the urgency, which raises an important question. Are we closer to a decision than it seems? Over the past few months, something subtle but important has changed. It's not a headline, not a sudden announcement. It's the tone. Lawmakers who were previously cautious are now speaking in a more open, exploratory way about digital assets. Instead of dismissing the space, the conversation has shifted toward how to regulate it, rather than whether it should be regulated at all. That distinction matters, because historically, once the discussion moves from resistance to structure, progress tends to follow. We've also seen increased engagement from regulatory bodies, more public hearings, and clearer acknowledgement that blockchain-based systems are not going away. And while none of this guarantees immediate action, it does suggest momentum is building beneath the surface. Markets don't always react to the final decision. They often react to the signals leading up to it. And right now, those signals are starting to align, which leads to the real dilemma most people are facing. At this point, it stops being about headlines and starts becoming a personal decision. Do you wait for full confirmation, or do you pay attention to early signals, even if they're not guaranteed? Most people naturally lean towards certainty. They want clear regulation, clear adoption, and clear price movement before making any move. And that makes sense. But markets rarely reward clarity. They usually move ahead of it. On the other hand, acting too early comes with its own risks, because not every expectation turns into reality. With XRP, the conversation often centers around utility, its potential role in liquidity, settlement, and cross-border transactions. But that potential depends on one thing: real adoption supported by clear frameworks. And while progress is happening, it's not fully there yet. So what you're really deciding isn't just about XRP. It's about how you approach uncertainty itself. And that's where most people get stuck. Here's the part that often gets lost in all the speculation. Development hasn't been standing still. Ripple has continued expanding its payment solutions across multiple regions, working with financial institutions to test faster cross-border settlement. That doesn't mean global adoption has fully arrived, but it does mean real-world use is already being explored, and in some cases, implemented. In other words, this isn't just a concept waiting for approval. It's a system being built and refined in parallel with the regulatory conversation. And historically, markets tend to react after infrastructure reaches a certain level of maturity, not before. By the time everything is fully visible, the early phase is already over, which makes this moment unusual, because you're seeing both sides at once: ongoing development and incomplete clarity. And when those two begin to align, the shift can happen faster than most expect. So when you put everything together, the delays, the shifting tone, the ongoing development, you start to see a different picture. Not a finished story, but a system in transition. XRP isn't just being evaluated on price right now. It's being shaped by regulation, adoption, and how global finance chooses to evolve over time. And none of those pieces move instantly. They build quietly, then change suddenly. That's what makes this phase so difficult to read. Because from the outside, it can look like nothing is happening. But underneath, the structure may already be forming. And as that structure continues to develop, the conversation around XRP could look very different in the future. Not because of hype, but because of how the system itself changes. So the real question isn't just where things stand today. It's whether you're reacting to what's visible or paying attention to what's still unfolding. At this point, everything comes down to how you interpret what you're seeing. On one side, there's uncertainty. No final regulatory framework, no clear timeline, no guarantees on how adoption plays out. On the other side, there are signals, ongoing development from Ripple, increasing discussion at the policy level, and a financial system that is slowly opening the door to alternatives. Both realities exist at the same time, and that's what makes this moment so important. Because most people wait for the moment when everything feels obvious. But by then, the opportunity, if there is one, often looks completely different. So this isn't really a question about XRP, it's a question about perspective. Do you wait for confirmation, or do you pay attention to the structure forming before it's fully visible? Because the answer to that question is what ultimately separates reaction from preparation. So after everything, the delays, the discussions, the shifting tone, you're left with something much more important than a price prediction: perspective. Because right now, XRP sits at the intersection of three forces: evolving regulation, developing infrastructure led by Ripple, and a global financial system that may be slowly adapting to new technology. None of these guarantee a specific outcome, but together, they create a situation that's still unfolding. And that's the key. This isn't a finished story, it's a transition phase, one that often feels quiet, uncertain, and easy to overlook, until it isn't. So instead of asking where XRP is today, the more useful question might be, what changes if these pieces continue to align? Because in markets, and especially in emerging systems, those shifts rarely announce themselves in advance. They build quietly, then show up all at once. And by the time everyone agrees on what's happening, the moment to understand it has already passed. Here's the reality. Nothing you've seen so far guarantees what happens next. There's still uncertainty, still delays, still unanswered questions around regulation, adoption, and timing. But at the same time, there's movement. Infrastructure continues to develop through companies like Ripple. The global system, still heavily reliant on networks like Swift, is being challenged by faster alternatives. And policymakers are no longer ignoring the space. They're actively discussing how it fits into the future. That combination matters, because major shifts in financial systems don't happen all at once. They build slowly, quietly, often while most people lose interest. And then, at some point, they become impossible to ignore. So this isn't about predicting a price. It's about recognizing a phase where uncertainty and development exist at the same time, where signals are present, but not yet confirmed, and where the biggest mistake isn't being early. It's not understanding what you're looking at while it's still forming. Because by the time everything feels obvious, it usually is. The content is for educational and formational purposes only, and should not be considered financial, investment, or legal advice. Cryptocurrency markets involve significant risk. Always do your own research. Thank you.